Hello everyone, welcome to a new video in which we're going to analyze emotion. So with me is the wonderful and kind Ana Coman, who decided to actually help me with this motion analysis. You might have seen Anna around at competitions, but you might also have seen her as the ESL Open finalist of EUDC last year in the far, far away Bulgaria. But also she has seen many competitions like Sofia Online Open, Budapest Open, and a lot more. So thank you, Anna, for being here and helping us.
Thank you for having me.
So what we're gonna do is we're gonna just show emotion. Anna has already seen the motion, has had about 3 to 4 minutes to just think about it. We're then gonna talk about the motion, golf side, upside, and we're gonna make some technical notes just so that people have an idea of how to attack this motion and how Anna would deal with these kinds of motions. So this motion has an info slide. It reads, citizen journalism is citizen-based journalism, where citizens play an active role in the process of collecting, reporting, analyzing, and disseminating news and information. And then the motion reads, this house opposes the rise in consumption of citizen journalism.
Are we
So
doing the regrets or the opposes?
it is practically the same. That there is no real delta. Opposes is a cleaner version of the motion, actually.
I agree.
Okay, so
Okay.
let's immediately start. You had some technical notes from Gov side, Anna.
Yes. So before jumping into arguments, two things that kind of jump out when you look at the motion and that I think are relevant when building the case to note are that this is a slightly altered version of the motion I knew, which is opposes or regrets the rise of citizen journalism, but this is in consumption of citizen journalism. I don't think it changes the actual content of the debate much, but it means that there is an extra link that you need to make, ideally at the beginning, and then tie back every argument to it about that the rise in consumption naturally leads to the rise in production as well, because it works on a demand basis. So then without the rise of consumption, you wouldn't have had the rise of journalism. But I will note this also means that you can also talk about the consumption itself and whether it's a good phenomenon, whether it's done well. So I think it adds more depth and one extra logical link to be made. Also one which you can take advantage of in closing or in the opposing bench if another team doesn't make this link. The second strategic thing is that there is that enumeration, the process of collecting, reporting, analyzing, and disseminating, which means that in case anyone runs out of extensions or if the opening burns everything they had, I think a tactic would be to just focus on one remaining aspect that your opening hasn't touched upon, and then building your extension on it. Also because it's easy, especially with journalism, it's easy to prove that the aspect you are focusing on is actually the bottleneck that affects the other aspects most. So if your opening didn't touch on disseminating, you can build your extension on that and prove why dissemination is the most relevant part and the other ones are sort of secondary, maybe symmetrize them a bit. Or, for example, if they don't touch upon collecting, so the kind of news that are being broadcasted through citizenship journalism, then you just focus on that and explain how it changed the situation so much that the other aspects are almost marginal comparing to the delta that the collection has had under citizenship journalism. So that's just sort of strategic notes to keep in mind when building the golf case.
Yeah. So you can pick one of them, make them either logically prior, but you can also do is you can just say this is just more important independent of its prior or not, because it affects more people or it affects news in a more significant way or this kind of stuff. So there's also other ways of way that you can do. In fact, there's an enumeration, which is quite nice. So
Yes.
Anna, you had a couple of arguments for golf. What
Yeah.
are they?
So I think there's three broad areas. I have, I think, 5 arguments, but depending on how you want to build them, they can be mushed into fewer. So the first area is individuals. So it mostly touches upon the collecting and the reporting aspects, and maybe analyzing as well. There's, I think, three broad things. Firstly, that individuals, as opposed to, professional journalists, are likely to have more inaccurate collecting and reporting, both because they don't have they don't know the skills on how to properly report. Maybe they don't know that, for example, you should check with 3 sources before you push an information forward. Maybe they don't have the network of people to check. Maybe they can't find the sources. Maybe they are unaware of the full context, so they give you a very sort of small version of it instead of understanding and putting it in context. Secondly, it's very likely that a citizen, so a person who isn't professionally trained, isn't aware of the rules that you need to follow. This can be either deontological rules, such as you always give a person the ability to respond. So you need to contact the person you're reporting about and give them a chance to say something in their defense. Or it can also mean rules about how you should transmit this information, or how you should collect it, what's legal to put forward or what's not, where you have a duty to protect your sources, which is very likely that somebody who's not trained might not be able to do. So this is the first thing. The second thing is obviously that you risk the news being significantly more biased or significantly more taken out of context, because these people don't have overwatch from an editor or from a publishing house, and also don't get accountability if they publish something shit. They just publish something on their Facebook page. Maybe they don't feel the same kind of duty, and they don't have the professional network around them to keep them accountable. And 3, this is more marginal but worth mentioning, if it's about risky reporting, so I don't know, reporting on an incident, whether it's a fire or a conflict or a war, the rise of consumption and the rise of production of citizen journalism means that you're likely to want to publish this, and you're likely to put yourself into dangerous situations and without being aware of the effect that this could have on you. Whereas a journalist who goes into a conflict area, for example, is prepared, has gone through a lot of trainings, and knows how to defend and protect themselves. So I think these are the broad stuff I have on the individual level, like micro level.
Okay, I only have a couple of things that we can discuss here. So if I look at your analysis of the idea of like an individual versus a journalist, the underlying like implicit framing that you have here is that most likely journalism, or just like citizen journalism, looks like independent people actually reporting this kind of stuff. How would you actually like prove this framing compared to what the framing other side might say, which is, this is more just like you have these journalists and then they just use more sources from like citizens and that kind of stuff. So they use these citizens as like there's an interlink between citizens, but it's not necessarily citizens self-reporting.
I think that's a fair question. But I'm thinking, so there's analysis. I'm thinking if there is anything I need to say. Yeah. So I think one, you point to the fact that there has been a rise in I don't know, Facebook or Insta posts where people directly stream from from their local area. You see this in conflicts, you see this in Gaza, you've seen this in Yemen. So you point to increased numbers of reporting. Then I think you point to, which are examples, so you would need to give structural reasons. Then you point to an increased number of blogs and vlogs on YouTube. I think the structural reasons for why that is true, instead of the op framing you mentioned, is that journalists will always go for more established and, in inverted commas, trustworthy sources, and they wouldn't pivot towards citizens unless they really, really had to. which means that very likely the increased rise of citizen journalism is related to people reporting themselves. I think that's the way I said. Do you
Yeah.
do you think
that's
there's
absolutely fair. Sorry, what do you want to ask?
I wanted to ask if there's other ways you'd see proving this.
I think there's also maybe a way where you could say that the sheer number of people who are able to do this means it's very easy to wash them out, especially because it's very accessible. So it's just a bit more detail on like what you're saying about social media and YouTube. Like, why do people watch so much YouTube clips? Just because it's free, it is really easy. But then paying for like the New York Times or the Washington Post is just a bit more expensive. People are unwilling to do that. So it's kind of like maybe a bit more of a analysis that hooks onto your analysis on social media. But no, I would agree here, and I think you can also say something along the lines of like norms changing as well, is that people see more of these citizens journalism, feel like they can do it themselves. Maybe they feel like, oh, now this attack happened in my city, I'm gonna like ask people, they get inspired and this kind of stuff. So there's a self-reinforcing effect where people feel like they can report, and kind of like gives them a feeling of power or an idea of that they're doing good, or that this is socially good because they see a lot of other people doing it. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think there's other ways that you can maybe prove that framing. So another thing that I noticed is that where you're talking about maybe the problems that these individuals have when it comes to the form of journalism that they do, is you're talking a bit about the pragmatics, which are, you don't know how to, double check or source check. And you also do the part about ethics, such as maybe like protecting your sources, which again, you can make practical. It's like if you can protect your sources, then no one wants to talk to you again next time. But is there maybe an interesting way where you could think of where you would weigh maybe the ethics side higher than the pragmatic side? Because I feel like for a lot of people, it's intuitive that the practical stuff is very easy to impact and weigh. I think people just have more difficulty with explaining how the ethical side would actually outweigh the practical side.
Do you mean the ethical side on like protecting sources?
Yeah, but also what you can or should not report on. So it's like
Yeah.
I don't know what it's called, but then you make like a fake accusation or like an unsubstantiated accusation that can hurt the people's image. And then there's also legal ramification, but there's also like moral ramifications for that.
Yeah, yeah. So I'll give the actual answer in a second. My honest take is that if ideally you run a principle, but you also impact it pragmatically to make sure that it doesn't get washed out. So I'll go into how you wait over, but my genuine advice is after you wait over, you also add a tiny coda on how why it impacts pragmatically. So you're sort of insured against it being outframed with a sentence and the judge buying it. Let's see. Yeah, so I think the way you can go about it is you can say, the main reason why journalism works as a thing, like as a broad thing, is because people are comfortable enough to speak out because they know that some principles will be, which is I'm aware also slightly pragmatic, but anyway, because they're aware some principles will be followed, which gives them a safety, but two comfort. The upholding of these principles, like them existing, is dependent on every person in the job following these principles. If you have an increased number of people breaking it, this reflects both on the behaviors of journalists around you, but also on the public, which means that you threaten the whole reporting, the whole journalistic thing as a whole, which is more relevant than whatever short-term impacts can be proven, because they sort of affect what do I call it? The core perception of journalism and its sort of essence, because it's passed down from journalist to journalist. So if it's altered at some point, very high chances that future journalists will also end up in an altered, unideal behavior. So frankly, I wouldn't go for full principles here. because I do think they matter a lot, but they matter because they affect broader dynamics, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think there's one way where I think you can maybe make the principle a bit more like sound principally, if that makes sense. Which is by analyzing that this is also a position of power that you have, and
Nice,
therefore
yeah.
there's an asymmetry, therefore you have a responsibility as an individual. So you can say even if there's some pragmatic stuff that you can get out of it, you have a power dynamic there, and you should hold that responsibility there. You can like use intuition pumps about like power asymmetry and that kind of stuff. But I do agree that this also kind of like links back or still proving that the pragmatic stuff that you're doing things badly or doing things that hurts other people, which is why it's bad for you to do these kinds of things. So it's very difficult to maybe indeed make it a just principle argumentation with principle weight.
Yeah, yeah. Mm, I think so. So I think what you say is the main thing. You're right, that the sort of power dynamic. I think you can also extend on not only do you have a duty towards the people you're reporting to, but I think you can also claim you have a duty towards the other people reporting as well. Maybe that's a way to make the stuff I said before a bit more principial. And your actions and whether you follow the rules affect others' capacity to do their jobs, earn a livelihood, blah, blah. So then principles should be upheld as well. I think you're right. I think that might be a good way to turn that into a more principial frame.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I don't have anything else I want to discuss about the specific first clash, or first clash or first point that we've talked about. Shall we just move on to the next one then?
Yep. Then I think the second one, always in journalism motions, is industry and how this affects the development of the industry. I think there's a few things you can claim are bad when there's more consumption and production of citizenship journalism. Firstly, that obviously this cannibalizes, this takes away some viewership from media outlets. I think the smart way to frame this is to say, look, The Economist and BBC will never be threatened by citizenship journalism, obviously. So the actual trade-off that happens is between you reporting about a local incident and your local newspaper being able to stay alive. And the way you frame it is you say local newspaper are already like pretty struggling. If they're not in the capital city of most countries, they're very likely barely breaking even. There might be some legwork here that needs to be done to prove this. But a lot of them are barely breaking even, which means that if there is even, I don't know, 20% increase of citizen journalism and posts on Facebook that take away 20% of their viewership, they might end up not being able to print their newspaper or having enough people to maintain the website. So impact you can claim is one, there's decreased, there might be a decrease of local establishments to report properly, which ties back to the first argument. Two, even if they don't disappear, then they decrease the amounts of funds that they allocate to certain things. This might mean firing people, or this might mean not giving journalists funds to go on field trips because they say people or there will already broadcast the things, so we can just take away buy images from them. You don't need to go there as a journalist. Obviously, you need to explain a bit why that's an issue. This might be the journalist in me geeking about it, but the way you explain this is that going on like on the ground for a journalist is very relevant to see details that maybe a person would miss because they're sort of taken away by everything going around. Like a journalist needs to be there to see context, see witnesses, see authorities. So there's a lot of stuff that happens on the ground exclusively if your publishing house, is it called? Newspaper room,
Yeah.
whatever. Your employer basically sends you there. if they don't have enough funds to send you there, then very likely you won't go there. And then obviously 3, I think, can impact on quality. Even if they try to maintain the same amount of writers and articles, the quality will decrease because you won't have that much time, because you will be assigned new tasks to make up for the money you lost because some citizenship journalism took away views from you.
Yeah, I think I would like to add 2 things. So let me just talk about the first thing. So the idea of like the local like newspapers and that kind of stuff. So I think it's interesting because I was thinking actually on the flip side of this for opposition side. I think we can discuss because I think there's a clash on there, which is it is easier for like new startups or actually for these newspapers to find new journalists because a lot of times it is based on like also people sending in pieces and volunteer work and that kind of stuff. So that when you have more people writing like that kind of stuff, you have a greater selection of people that you can make, pieces do or like, make them do pieces. So I guess you could say there's an easier competition argument you can make, but then indeed there is maybe less oversight. How would you frame the oversight in such a way that it shows that it's not only necessary, but also why that is inherently impossible with citizen journalism?
On Gov, right?
On Gov, yeah.
Yeah. So I think the first 2, I'd point to the ones, the points I made in the first argument, that they aren't surrounded by a network of editors that cut away stuff that's wrong, and by upper bosses who say we can't fit this into our news because it interacts badly with this or that in the public discourse. So I think the first one is you aren't responsive to any authorities. 2, you don't have a contract, which means that there's literally no way you can be held liable, which is obviously an issue if you, as you said, report falsely on something. Let me think. Oh yeah, I think there's also the fact that usual journalists have want to maintain a name for themselves, and if they do an ouchie boo boo, then that affects their collaborations in the future, their name, they won't get invited to stuff, which is something that you don't really give a shit about as a citizen, because you don't want to necessarily maintain a name in this. And I think maybe fourthly, if you do like a shit thing as a journalist on article that gets 10,000 views, then clearly you'll have massive backlash from your readers. But if you're a citizen journalist that broadcasts something that is seen by 100 people, you might get some pushback from 1 or 2 people, but a lot of times these people are from your community, so they might also agree. If, for example, you do sort of a slightly racist comment, for example, you might not get called out at all because it's people from your own bubble, but also the backlash is likely to be small enough for you to sort of wave it off and move on.
So let me just go a bit through these responses just to see how they kind of like compare to journalists versus individuals. Because you say, for example, the backlash points, like, you don't really care about backlash an individual. But I feel the intuitive up response is like, but if this is you're doing citizen journalism, most likely this is a hobby. So you want to be hired again or like do this sub project later on. So there's a similar incentive. If not, there is a like backlash, like, the community might not like you and that kind of stuff. So do you think that this is still like a fair response? Or do you think this doesn't actually work in real life?
I think a way to sort of wave, I agree it's rebuttable. I think a way to wave it off is to say, yeah, the newsroom might not ask you back again, but very likely there's others you can go to, as opposed to if you're a journalist who's hired, and if your boss gets upset with you, good luck finding another job with the bad reviews that they'll get you. That's one, which doesn't cancel out what you say. I think it mitigates it just at best to some degree. And the second one, I think you can argue that sometimes at least some people who do citizenship journalism aren't really in it for the long run. Like maybe some of them just have one stuff they start reporting on that they care about, because it's a tragedy that happened in their hometown, but then just move on with their life, which I think is somewhat plausible, to be fair. Like I wouldn't try to push that all of them are, you know, like full on committed to do this as a hobby, which allows you on Gov to say they won't care that much because they go away afterwards.
Yeah, and I think you can also then do here some likelihood analysis, which is
It-
there's more likely for this to happen, or there's a greater risk. We shouldn't take that risk as journalists for all of these reasons, because it's very important. Maybe another way to also think maybe about this is so the idea is you have independent, like maybe like publishing houses who are now hiring people with these contracts.
Mhm.
I think you can say that oftentimes people are more likely to still want to just publish independently on social media because you don't have the bureaucracy, you don't have the time, you have more control. It is also still quite viable money-wise because of things such as Patreon or just ads or maybe just doing a part-time job and all that kind of stuff. Which also explains why that alternative would not be possible.
Yes. And you can also add that if you sell your article to a newspaper, you give up the intellectual property rights to it, so you can't go back on it again. It now fully belongs to the newsroom. So very likely you'll want to keep it, especially if it's something that you care about.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's fair. Let me think. Do we now discuss the first part? There was also a comment I want to make on the second part, but in the meantime, have forgotten exactly what the point was. Can you just repeat that again for me?
The first part of the industry argument.
No, the second part of the argument on the industry.
Wait, hold on. So they lose. Let me go through the process again. They lose some the local newsrooms might
Yeah,
close. They lose funds, which means that they don't have money to send you on the field or to assign
yeah.
you to these articles anymore. And three is that they decrease quality because they need to assign you to other projects to make up for the money they lose when citizenship journalism takes away some of their viewership.
Yeah, but that was the first argument on industry, right? There was also a second point that you wanted to make, or you made.
I don't think so. I think those are the three ones.
Um, okay, then
Or I have goldfish memory.
yeah, then I think at that point we just go to the third argument
Yes. The third clash, right?
or the third clash. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I think a third clash is how this affects sources and platforms for information, which I'm aware is a sort of two-way argument. So the first one is how I think I'd go for how it affects platforms. I think this is a bit murkier and more difficult to make, but I think what you can argue is that when you have a rise of citizenship journalists, people start looking at them more in the best case of opposition, right? So like if they're successful, if they're quality-wise, blah, blah. People start looking at them more, which means that the algorithms on social media start prioritizing this to show to them. This also means that people have limited time, blah, 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 which means that with the little limited time that they have, they will choose to engage in this. Which means that how do I put this? The frame that they see reality through will in time, like in 6 months or in 1 year, become more and more composed almost exclusively of these kinds of things, and maybe 2 or 3 news they see on TV, right? Because they have a limited, let me put my phone on silent, because they have a limited attention span and everything. This means that a lot of the visibility of good news outlets who have checkups and everything will decrease by algorithms, even by algorithms alone. And I think you impact this on, look, it's not only that they get lower quality or blah, blah, but that the system becomes of such a nature that some people only get their worldview from people around them, which is not a great idea, because obviously people in your community might work in the same echo chamber as you. They might have a same angle on a corruption scandal, which is not the correct angle, or they might have, and it's crucial that you're exposed to a more sort of balanced view, which bigger news outlets usually have. So the way I see this and why I say it's murkier is because I think you need to explain that the ecosystem of journalism slowly shifts to not allow you access to other news outlets even if you wanted to. Like Facebook doesn't give you ads for The Economist anymore. Your local newspaper stand sells less newspapers because they saw less demand for it. So basically your options to take contact with bigger news outlets decrease, physically speaking, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think there's a way to prove it, which I just thought of. I think it is the first thing where you're saying like you're also used to it, which I also think where you're saying like you just hear these people, you have like form also maybe a like parasocial relationship with them, so therefore you follow them more, which means that you're less likely to look for those alternatives. And another thing you can say is oftentimes a lot of like also independent journalists take a bit of like an anti-establishment standpoint, either because they are hurt by the industry or this is just an effective way for them to make money, being like, look, established journalism doesn't want me to actually cover this, or I cannot cover this with established journalism, so please donate to my Patreon, all of this stuff. So there's an incentive for them to make you not go to these like big institutions, which means it is, even if it isn't necessarily the algorithm, is that the algorithm pushes these people to do that, so that then they don't go to alternative things on social media.
Yes. What I wanted to say on sources kind of also relates to the ecosystem a bit. So my idea here is a lot of official sources are anyways reluctant to talk to journalists. And when I say official sources, I mean actually a lot of them, like local municipalities, politicians in your local council who handle the funds directed to your small village, the police department in your area, the hospital chief, the hospital boss who handles scandals there, the PR person from the voting booth, the voting area that supervises how elections take place. All of these people are official, are gateways to official authorities. And they are anyways somewhat reluctant to talk to journalists, but they do because they have to, right? Currently, without the rise of citizenship journalists, they are afraid that if they don't talk to them, they will be butchered or that they won't get to say a viewpoint. I think you can argue that when citizen journalism rises up and everyone kind of starts saying, oh, half of the journalism I see is done by random people who seem to not really know what they're doing, then it's very, very easy for authorities to say, it's not that I don't want to talk to journalists, is that most of the journalists who approach me are random people who I can't really trust, who I don't know if they have oversight or not. So that's why I didn't give an official declaration. That's why I can't give them access to the records that they're requesting. They don't have a sort of accreditation. I don't know what's happening to them. So I think you can argue that this trend slowly allows authorities to refuse to talk to you by claiming incompetence, basically.
Yeah. I want to add something here, which is also on like maybe explaining why the quality of newspapers is better, which is a lot of things when it comes to official sources, you also need to have privacy rights and all of this stuff. And then that makes it easier for you to actually trust a journalist to do that than to give it to random people. So an example of this, which I just know of, is recently during the October the 7th attack, there were GoPros, which then showed what happened. But those were only shown in a closed room to the journalists, and then they could write stuff about it, but they weren't released to the public. So this only works because you cannot make this public because this also is, with related families or privacy reasons. So you can't really do it. So even if there's like not a want there, there's sometimes also just a lack of legal possibilities of doing it this way.
Yeah, yeah. And I will flag, I think there might actually be, if not an extension, at least half of an extension or half of a frame material here to say that, look, the other things about quality of articles doesn't really matter. I don't really care about funds. And you zero in on very, very delicate things that journalism deals with. And you say, this is the moment when having prepared people who are aware of legal implications is most relevant, and where 100% citizen journalism will fail because they don't know how to approach this. So this can be exactly what you're saying. Deaths of situations of violence. This can be, I don't know, trials that are ongoing, where you need to report saying allegedly, like small stuff that really impact how the news gets across. It can mean, I don't know, scandals, like Me Too scandals, where victim privacy needs to be protected like heavily. It can be corruption scandals, where if you aren't super careful in how you report what you know from whom you know, you have very high chances of your sources getting into jail or being beaten up on the street by people. So you can zero in on areas where privacy and skill are super relevant and then wash out everything else.
Yeah, no, I think that's indeed just good, just a bit more level of clarity. I had another question about your points about platforms, because the idea kind of is with like polarization, you have a bit more polarization, you get pushed into one direction, people follow the same kind of people. But in the alternative, you could say source medias like the Daily Mail also exist, and they also like keep putting a lot of like radical stuff for like for example immigrants or other kind of stuff, and they also have the incentive to use social media because it's a very easy platform. So how would you say that this is maybe comparative, or how would you say that this scales differently when you have citizen journalism versus establishment journalism?
Uh, the sneaky answer, which I think might unfortunately be the correct one, is that I'd say a conservative established media news outlet is more balanced than a conservative random person who wants to publish something on the subject. So you take echo chamber versus very tiny echo chamber, and you explain that even if people still exist in echo chambers, the newsrooms are more accountable and at least somewhat more balanced. Also because they have to be like by law, as in they need to give the right to reply to the person they're accusing. They can be sanctioned by national councils or whatever the fuck those are called. They have, as you were saying, contracts of privacy that they need to uphold. They are liable if they spread inflammatory or violent rhetoric. All of these things mean that at least some level of what's it called? Equidistance? Yeah. Accountability and decency is maintained, as opposed to a random person who, yes, might get their Facebook account shut, but that's basically the worst that can happen to them. Very unlikely they'll get sued for defamation.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Let me see. Is there any other things you want to talk about on the GOP side? Because we now talked about, as you see, the individual side, the industry side, the platform side.
I think we covered the news quality. No, I think that's it for now.
Yeah. I want to add maybe a bit more as well on the industry side, because
Mm-hmm.
a lot of this has been on like falls within the clash on quality of news or like yeah, either accuracy of news or the kinds of news that people consume. And then that's either via, you know, if the individual is better, if the industry shifts or not, and then if like social media platforms change, and then there's different levels of framing, and you can outframe why it's more important, and that's kind of like,
Yeah.
good. But a lot of it just feels like very similar because it's still about the accuracy of the clash. So one of the
Yeah.
things that I've thought of during the industry side is at the moment that you have this citizen journalism going up, you also most likely have a bit more of like freelancers, and you have more of
Mm-hmm.
like this being outsourced instead of being journalists towards these individuals, which then is bad because then you also give less power to, for example, unions who might represent journalism as a whole within those places. Or it is easier for them to be like, oh, why should we pay for you to do these over hours or like these extra hours that you're working when we can just ask someone on the ground to just write an opinion piece anyway, and then we can just publish that because it's just easier to find these people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, is there anything you want to add on this line?
Um, only a sort of long-term impact in that the way newsrooms decide where they allocate funds depends a lot on how much interest they see and whether they have alternatives. In that, if they're always able to use a freelancer to report on an area of the country, then they're very unlikely to set up a permanent correspondent there, which is obviously a problem because having a permanent correspondent there establishes trust, establishes connections, you get more accurate reporting. So I think you say they will very likely newsrooms will focus on the money cash cows, how they're called, like the very
Yeah.
profitable areas, the capital city tech area that makes them a lot of money, politics which makes them a lot of money, and then sideline all of the other departments and outsource them to citizen journalism so that they become just an afterthought for the newsrooms, which is obviously bad because the alternative is having a small department somewhere else in the country, but having a department nonetheless. Having a small, I don't know, arts and culture department, but having it and funding people who are specialized in this.
Okay. Okay. I think that's a good extra level of analysis. I think when I look mostly, I think these are kind of like also the guidelines that I've been thinking of. I also know that we like said that around this time you needed to go. Do you still want to do the upside for this,
Yes.
or do you want
Yeah.
to?
No, I can do the upside. No worry.
Okay. What do you think like the opposite side is? Do you think it's the same kind of like clashes, or do you think
Yes.
they're also like a bit different?
No, I think it's the same kind of clashes. This is an unexciting motion in terms of symmetry. It's pretty symmetric, but that's good, obviously, because it allows you to swap things around. Do you want to go for the individual area?
Um, for me to start, you mean, or you mean
Do you
for
want to start with the individual clash?
I
Like
think we
by
should start the same way, just like with the individual clash. Why don't you just start with what you have there for up, and then I'll try to add on.
Yeah. So I think obviously the biggest thing here is that it empowers people to tell stories that would otherwise be ignored. I think I will flag, I think here there's a lot of stylistic emphasis that can be brought here. So I really think this is an argument where style comes in pretty relevant. Like you can probably up your speaks and the relevance of your argument by picking correct examples and showing why it might be relevant. Here, I think there's three areas that matter. Stories that would be ignored in terms of topic. If you're a minority, very unlikely that a newspaper would pick your story very often. Whereas when this citizen journalism rises, you can tell this story to people who care and who are willing to listen, and you can report constantly on your community, which is in and of itself valuable. Somebody watches, those people feel listened to, they see somebody coming in there and caring about how their life evolves day to day, not once a year when the big newsroom decides to do something on them, if ever. So topic. Secondly, angle. For example, I think you can very easily argue that, for example, in highly conservative countries, it is likely that 90% of major news outlets are going to be somewhat conservative leanings, and there is a lot of relevance into having, I don't know, feminist viewpoints being brought up, which is very, very likely to only happen through citizen journalism, because you'd never get past the editor from the conservative newsroom. And 3, in terms of area, so you basically flip the point on Gov and you say, look, in a lot of countries where newspapers struggle, they barely have a local correspondent for the poorer regions. With citizen journalism, yes, you maybe don't get a national audience, but you get the audience of the people in your district or the people in your broad general area, and you report on the abuses there, which is significantly better than having it once a year done by the bigger news outlet. I think there's obviously a lot of pragmatic stuff to be impacted here in terms of, even if they don't get viewership, you get, what's it called? You account for these communities, right? You get some numbers, you get, which you can then pass on to NGOs, for example. There is posts, a lot of posts about a community that you can follow or that somebody can follow if they want to write an academic article about this. So it basically accounts for the evolution of lives that would otherwise go completely unaccounted for. You can obviously impact it on a catharsis level. It's just emotionally relevant. A, that you're able to do that as a person who didn't go to journalism school but deeply cares about this, but 2, as a community or as a person who is maybe for the first time listened to. I think given what Gov will definitely argue, you can't know, you will look bad quality, blah, blah, blah. This argument ideally has embedded in it some mitigation. The kind of mitigation I think can be done is, 1, obviously, you can learn. It's not that fucking hard. You read half of the articles written in media outlets are written by people who are in their BA in journalism, who read 2 or 3 manuals, and that's about it. It's not really that hard. You read a book. If you have some skills in creative writing, you can very easily do a decent article. It doesn't have to be a 5 pages opinion poll. It's just a news like 3 paragraphs. It's not that hard to nail down. That's the first one. The second one is like, dude, people who would get into citizen journalism clearly are people who have some affinity to it, right? They're people maybe who work in humanities, or like people who understand these things, people who have basic knowledge of sociology. Like it's not, you don't take somebody off the street to do this. The third thing, in terms of checking sources and stuff like that, you don't need to be a journalist to do that. You need to know that you have to, which you find out if you just Google search 5 things to do if you want to be a journalist. But then you can request public information from local authorities by law. There's a declaration, I don't know what number it has in other countries, but there is like a very specific code in, like a very specific law that requires all public institutions to give information to anyone who requests them for the public good. So here it doesn't fucking matter if you're a journalist or not, and you file this request on any public authority, and they are obligated to give you those information.
Okay, that is good. I have a lot of things actually to add here, but they're just kind of like maybe just different angles what you're already saying, just like adding some examples here. So when you're talking about the source, let's just start there. I think maybe also an interesting thing what you could is like because you also are most likely a bit more on social media and there is maybe more this interpersonal connection, people also feel more comfortable to you approaching them for like, asking questions if you work at a big company and that kind of stuff. Or they might be like, oh, actually, I want to help understand or like give you information about Shell and what they're doing with pollution. So I have a mate who works there. Maybe I can somehow connect you and that kind of stuff. So it's also like not only the formal side that you can do it, but also maybe the unique side because of the fact that you are a citizen journalist. Another generic thing is people love calling out bad journalism because it's just very clickbaity, it's very emotionally. So you can say, there's a mechanism of backlash on social media, which just means that you also have this accountability and that kind of stuff. Um, and now I just want to talk about the things you already said. So you say like you can have different angles. So the way you can also think about this is maybe if you're a journalist, you actually don't know that much about data analysis or one specific niche. And this form of journalism actually allows for that. So a neat example of this is in the Netherlands, bird watching is quite big, but it's also quite science driven if you go into the community. So they actually make reports on like the population levels of different like animals and correlations and causations between other kinds of things, which even biological like biology scientists just didn't know or just weren't looking at. And these then get like published in their own kind of like paper, but then they're also doing this in like local things where they're like now writing about this. So that's just like a fun example that I just know of that I just wanted to add. And then there are two other things. So you talk about these communities where you just have maybe feminism being, now shown in these conservative areas. I think the response to this is like, but you might have progressive areas where you now have conservatism being under like, shown. And I think a way to also deal with this is, look, a lot of stuff when it comes to, our society, it like there are rational ways and fair ways to argue either way. The most important thing is just having a mutual understanding. And at the moment you're able to find a middle ground in which you're able to everybody to find each other or understand each other, that's important. But then you need to have people who explain it to you in a way that you can understand, where it feels a bit more one-on-one and isn't judgmental or that kind of stuff. Again, you then do need to react to the points which you already talked about, which is the algorithm and the fact that you might get pushed into a bubble and this kind of stuff. But I think there's ways that you can explain this, which is just, showing also that just inherently understanding is just a good thing in society, which is then the opposite of the polarization point. And then lastly is the idea of also the kinds of things that can be shown. So this is maybe also the angle point that you're talking about. But I think what you could say is sometimes citizen journalism just looks like this is what it's like to live in Ukraine right now in a war zone. And then you just have people just showing this is what it means. Like the products like go up really much, but like how does this affect the choice that you make as an individual? You get a greater empathy and understanding for these individuals. And therefore you also just you can say like more aware of issues, you create more empathy, all of this stuff, which is very difficult to do in newspapers. Like you can maybe say, this woman has said a very sad story about her Ukraine time, and then you have like maybe 2 to 3 paragraphs, but you don't have those continuous videos which you're also talking about this is what the community looks like. This is how it kind of works. So yeah, a different way maybe to delineate it.
I agree. I think I have a follow-up on this, and I also realized something as you were talking. I think a great way to sort of expand your last point is to explain that a lot of times, especially in conflict zones, when journalists are sent by their news outlet, the news outlet pays for everything, which means that where you go, what you see and what you report on is exclusively handled by them. This means that a lot of times, for example, when you have journalists going in Gaza now, they go with the local authorities. They are only shown what they want them to see. They're only shown the better areas, or like you don't get to see the lives of people on the ground, especially if you came through like Israeli permits and things like this, as opposed to somewhat reckless journalists that citizens, sorry, that do journalism, that are willing to go on their own and they're not accountable to anyone. They And a lot of times they want to see on the ground things. And this is actually something that happens a lot for war journalists who aren't tied to a newsroom. They are the ones, exactly as you were saying, who go into the most to the least well-off areas, that talk to the people, that extend their stay a few more days to understand the community, to gather the trust of the community. They're the people who refuse to hide their camera when the officials say, dude, please don't film this. They find a way to film it anyway. So because they have less restriction and maybe less legal liability, they a lot of times catch the real stories that officials in war areas would want swept under the rug.
Yeah. And also maybe to make this even clearer, I think you're getting at this, but they also maybe have the unique capacity to do so because
Yes.
they know the language. They also might be more accepted by people on the ground because it's like, an American going to a war zone, it's like, it's this American. But if it's like, oh no, this is just the local guy from another village, then
Yes.
maybe a bit more willing to also talk.
Exactly. And I think a tiny coda from this, which can be a coda from this, but can also be a bigger thing, is that newsrooms will very rarely go for risky articles. I know the answer to Gov is they have the money to cover if it goes south. They do have the money, but they choose not to, because why would they? Like, very rarely you see risky stuff being published, as opposed to citizen journalism, who is funded by Patreon. So people who probably support you, have seen you do risky stuff before, trust you, don't mind if you fuck up from time to time. And a lot of times the risky stuff that that is getting published is the most valuable one. So for example, I'm thinking of a documentary that was done by a sort of citizen journalist about a Romanian person who went to fight in Ukraine and came back with massive PTSD and sort of completely disillusioned about the war effort to free Ukraine, which is very risky. You wouldn't really risk publishing this on a bigger news outlet, but it was an incredibly deep story, and it's good that it got out by a citizen journalist.
Okay. Yeah, no, I agree. That's also like an interesting line on risk. Okay, I think like we've gone into a lot of depth now about like the quality. We still have two other, or like, I guess the individual side, which kind of like links with the quality part. Do you have any new points on industry? Because I already discussed this a bit with Gov side, but my
Yes.
idea was it is easier for news, like new agencies to pop up. Another thing is, also have more sites where you can have like more pay for freelance journalists, and then you can buy, for example, packages where you then like, see what this one produced, but also other people. And there's also like, again, here sort of algorithm where they want to push you other people that you can also read so that you just maximize engagement. And then you can say, because now there is the shift of hiring also maybe these citizen journalists, and it's become more normal for individuals to engage in a one-on-one level, this site has become like larger, and that's overall good because then people can self-select. Maybe they want more time for stories, and then they get that time. Um, all of this kind of stuff. Is there anything else that you feel like you want to add on this point, or maybe even just on this clash on the industry?
The only thing I'd add is on revenue sources, because I think what happens with time is that you get a shift in people's mentalities. 20 years ago, it would have been inconceivable to have stuff funded by public crowdsourcing. But the reason it kept happening is because people kept seeing stuff that they liked. They donated once, then they saw the money being used well, then they donated to another thing. The sites encouraged each other. They made, I don't know, collabs. And then you donated and you saw the money being used well. So I think you argue that with time, you create a culture of donating to more sort of individual outlets and individual efforts, which translates to them becoming self-sustainable in time and not needing to always do gig work for big news outlets. So then you also structurally prove that you get independence in the medium, not even long term, in the medium term, exclusively if you have citizen journalism, because the only way they get independence is if they shift away and if you have a critical mass of citizen journalism happening and you're not the odd duck out who asks for money and it feels fishy. If a lot of people do that and you donate a lot of times and you see it going well, you're like, yeah, I'm happy to donate again as a member of the public.
I think it's very good. It's maybe also a bit of a right wing like case, which like the market will solve it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And so not only the market will solve it, it's also you create a market for it. That's the thing. I think you argue you literally make out a new market. Oh, and there's obviously from this an impact to be made that big newsrooms suddenly have competition. So they need to diversify as well because there's only so much you can dig into subjects you already cover and people who already read your newspaper.
Yeah, yeah. You can also say actually the power dynamic switches. Because I
Yes.
think that what we said on GovSide is these institutions have more power, and then they're basically saying, we're not going to hire you. And they say, but in the medium to long term, actually, now this all the journalists, like the good journalists who can become independent. So now they can hold the big newspapers accountable. So there's
Yes.
like which power dynamic is more likely, that kind of stuff. So it's also maybe a time thing where it's like maybe in the beginning it's this way, but in the long term it will change.
Yeah.
Maybe some interesting ways that you can frame that clash.
Yeah. And you can impact this in a lot of ways. Like you can negotiate better contracts because now they know that you can just go on your own and do just as well. Labor unions have bigger leverage power. You as a journalist inside the newsroom can argue for riskier topics. For example, the Spotlight investigation in the Catholic Church abuses happened because one of the editors at a random small news outlet fought with his teeth to get this story across, despite the fact that it dragged on for a long time, despite the fact that it was risky. And he was lucky that he managed to persuade the editor to let him run it. If you see more of these things being done by other people, very likely the big news outlet will allow you as a journalist there to also do it.
Yeah, yeah. So this is interesting because now it again comes back to the clash on quality of journalism or the kind
Yes.
of like things to discuss, but also just
Yes.
like the industry was just better for you as an individual. You get more wages, you actually get paid for the work.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you want to add anything on, so you don't want to add anything else on the industry side?
I don't think so.
Okay.
That's the things I have so far.
Then we can just lastly talk about again the platforms and sources.
Mhm.
What do you think here on upside you can bring?
One, regulation on platforms, because Gov keeps saying, oh, but you have bad quality, you might have hate speech, blah, blah. And you say, yes, but as this rises, users see a lot of shit reporting. Yes, maybe. So the report button comes up, or people reach out, the consumers reach out to Facebook and they say there needs to be better content moderating on your platform. So they expand what's it called? The department of Facebook that looks at the videos and makes sure there's nothing like graphic violence and stuff like this. So the answer is when you reach critical mass, the platforms and the algorithms shift to allow the community to provide feedback properly. The YouTube, all of the tiny modifications that YouTube has made in order to accommodate these things. So you say the system changes because people want to react to things, either because they like them, either because they hate them. Either way, there is a automatic regulation. And I think the second thing is the flip side to what we were talking about on the legitimacy of non-accredited journalists. The more citizen journalism happens, the more authorities and sources, as you were saying, are likely to be willing to talk to you, even if you don't have a journalism badge. because they see you as capable and more legitimate, which empowers the first argument. So it's maybe at best a coda, I think.
Okay. Okay. I have an interesting idea on your regulation points when it comes to these platforms. So I think you can say that in the absence of this citizen like thing, because it's also about decimating and consuming this information, it
Mhm.
means that it is going to be actually more push for both political powers and in general to actually then make sure that you have better algorithms. So you can say either because Facebook now has Facebook News or Google has Google News, so they branch into that industry. So therefore they just have these extra regulations that they need to follow. There's more eyes on that, or it matters more for politicians because now what people care about, what they think about, now also based on these platforms. So whereas maybe before it was more of a public forum and it didn't really matter if you had like hate speech or like bad things happening there because it's like people opt into it. It's like it's not that important for other stuff or it's not that direct link to politicians or them entering the sector. It means that you don't really get that many regulations, but now you get significantly more regulations, which isn't just good because it just defeats government's push, but you can say all the extra sectors that they have about like hate speech now get also washed out. So that means you
Nice.
don't have these platforms being harmful. It's just a net good in general.
Yep, yep. Yeah, that works. And it proves incentive and capacity on the long term.
Yeah. And I think there's an interesting point that you also brought, right? It's the idea that, sharing information to unaccredited individuals.
Mhm.
Do you think it's also more likely for these, like maybe companies or these institutions to also just post this information themselves online or to have more maybe some open source stuff? Because I think that also might become problematic where on God's side, you can say this is problematic because then you literally have the company filter it for you. And therefore people might have, you create more power, people may be willing to believe it. But then for journalism, there might be some check-in mechanism or they might be able to verify it with internal sources and that kind of stuff. How do you think that maybe this adds to that clash of non-accredited individuals getting more information?
I think the way you can frame it is to say that even the reason why this is better, like having official institutions post stuff on their own in their own what's it called, initiative, is because even if technically as a citizen you have the right to request this information, there is a lot of hurdles they can make you jump through to make this process significantly more difficult for you and to prevent you from doing it a second time. From massive amounts of bureaucracy you need to fill in, to huge waiting times, to people saying, which actually happens a lot, we hear about this a lot, to actually telling the citizen, yes, you're more than welcome to access this information. It's in our archives. We don't have enough personnel to have somebody filter it out for you. But if you're willing to spend a week in our archive in the basement with no lightning, you're more than welcome to. We're not guarding any information. You can access it, but obviously very few people would go there because you're fighting against the windmills.
Yeah.
So all of these things can come in your way if you try to access important information, which in the long term kind of means that only big news outlets can undertake this because you need a fucking team and a salary for 2 weeks to be able to dig this out. On the flip side, if they start publishing stuff on their own, some stuff gets digitalized. Some of those archives get sorted out. Um, there is one person who went through this process, so clearly you can reach out to them and ask how to navigate the archives if you go there. So they need to have some people responsible, which eases the process for non big media outlets.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you can also maybe add that here. Not only will this become the norm, but also maybe if there are some tips or things that you can say to speed it up, or some things where you like, actually, this is not how you should do it. This is not how legally you should proceed, because the information is also more out there, because there are more like independent journalists. Then clearly it also becomes easier because there's more information sharing.
Yes. Oh yeah, actually. I think you can also argue there is a lot of information sharing, like networking platforms, Facebook groups, informal meetings for citizen journalism. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to add on opposition side?
Not that I can think of now.
So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to summarize this long discussion by just doing a bit of the clashes and see how they interact. If you want to add anything afterwards, then feel free to. And then after that, I think we can call it a wrap. So the first clash is clearly on the kind of quality of the news. So you can talk about having the right accountability mechanisms. You can talk about having the right skills, knowing what you should do, or having maybe unique access to sources, all this stuff from government side. And the upside, you could say you might also have, uniquely new kinds of things that you can show, maybe from the community, maybe in these war zones, you have different people. There is a form of accountability on social media that happens that mitigates a lot of this. You're able to maybe show minority opinions more, therefore create more understanding and that kind of stuff. So therefore, there's a lot of like quality news that you can get, and then you can say this is good because either kind of quality of information makes sure that people have more understanding of each other, or they vote better because they just know what the issues are, or political parties change their opinions because now they know what is actually salient or what actually is the problem instead of like maybe creating new problems. And therefore that specific clash matters. Then there's another part about, I guess, like competition within the industry. So you can say it is very likely on Gulf side that local papers just get screwed over. They're going to have less possibility to actually, exist or do the research that they would normally need to. Or on the other side, you can maybe say it's easier for new competitors to start up and or for freelance to become big. And then you can talk about how that might be, creating more competitions and therefore these new news sources get created. And then you can say, is it more important to have these local versus maybe these new startups? They also have this idea on the industry, which is also again linked to the freelance part. But you can say, overall, the moment you're freelance, you might have less protections because you don't have unions that have collective bargaining. You might also be misused by these big news sources where they're going to be like, we're actually going to hire just this local journalist over you, so we're going to screw you over that way. Whereas the other side, you can say, well, actually, you're able to unionize more easily because you can find other resources for funding or just more networking. And therefore, you're actually able to have better rights. So then the impact on this is just like not the first thing is quality because people work more together and that kind of stuff. But also independent impact you can just run on journalists just have better, jobs, better lives, and that's important. You can frame them as often as being overworked. Just having this being a lot better for the mental health is just something that we should care about. Or also again, if you have better mental health, you're less stressed, then you're just a better journalist as well. So you can also again link this back to quality if you necessarily want this to. Lastly, we just basically have this idea of polarizations and platforms. So you could say on Gov side, it is more likely for you to steer away from these like traditional sources and then steer more maybe to like a rabbit hole where you're going to become more extreme, which leads to then less understanding. And it also might be that the journalists that you go to just have lower quality. And then on the other side, you could say actually this forces to have more regulation, which is not just good for journalism, but also just good for other things that happen on the social media sites, having less, people saying hateful stuff. And as well, you can talk about how in the end, you're going to have maybe on these platforms, just also more information from these like big companies being like made public and that kind of stuff, which basically links a bit back to the quality argument that we had before, where you now have uniquely access to sources that you didn't have before, or there may be more ways that individuals can hold companies accountable because they can request more and more and more, which just means that it just forces more transparencies from these companies. Okay, I think that this is roughly a sketch of what all the things we've discussed. Are there any things that you want to note on this, or maybe something that you noticed from the summary?
No, I think it summarizes it pretty well. The only thing I would say is that we went through them sort of in a how do I put it? We had a broad discussion on this, but I think a lot of the rough content can be shaped on any of the clashes. That is to say, our first parts about the individual quality of reporting, I think can be shaped into a sub-explanation for the industry part or for the regulation. So I think just to flag to people that a lot of this content, as opposed to other motions where you kind of have separate threads altogether, a lot of this content feeds into each other. So it can be virtually arranged into any tagline that you need it to be arranged into, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree with this. I want to note on this front that we're talking about having access to source and having a better quality of information. I think when we make the summary, it is very abstract, which like our quality of information just goes up, accuracy goes up. But I think it's important when you impact, especially in this case, to be very specific. Like,
Yes.
in what way is this content better? Is it better because it shows different perspectives? Is it better because it is more accurate? Is it better because it has more like checks, or because it just hurts less people because it doesn't like, do inflammatory talk, or just doesn't like follows the law and that kind of stuff? Like, be specific. And also weigh this specific thing you're talking about. So why is it that, making sure this happens ethically and legally is the most important thing in debate? Why is it that showing this unique perspective is more important than maybe having more checks and more accuracy? I think that will help, because I think what you're saying indeed is like, you can use a lot of points to basically prove a lot of the same impacts. At which point it can become very muddy, because then you need to decide, maybe as a judge, which reasoning to the same impact do you think is important. But if you just give the judge weighing on, no, we go for this specific impact, and this specific impact is the most important thing, then it just becomes, easier to give you the win.
Yes.
Yeah.
And especially, and also if you want to avoid the muddiness, something that which happens a lot in journalism debates, is from time to time, and from time to time, I mean several times during an argument, if it's a chunky one, to stop and to say, what this part of the argument proves to you is incentive of industry to change long term, or what the upshot of this part is to prove capacity of individual journalists to have quality reporting. So basically give the judge from time to time meta commentary on what you just proved, because in the OA it's very likely that this will be what it comes down to. Did anyone prove capacity of did anyone prove incentive of X, Y, and Z? If you flag them strategically as I've proven this, it's easier for them to use it to argue for you in the call.
Yeah. And I think this is also really good, because I think that the moment you force yourself to say, this is what I've proven, I think it's also likely for the speaker to say, and this is why it's important. But even if you don't do it because you don't have the time, and you're just like a person who just spams max and that kind of stuff, it is now significantly easier for the whip to be like, as my speaker said, we have proven capacity. Why does capacity, win this debate? Or why does this win over opening half? So just this flagging and this explicit weighing is just very nice as a judge. So yeah, I think that's a good comment.
Yeah. The main thing you want to avoid is getting a very big muddy case, which I think is especially harmful for closings, because then you don't know what the fuck you can add, because you surely have tiny things to add, but you don't know how to single them out as being most relevant. And I think what you said here works very well. You single out what you prove strategically, you weigh it off, and then you have an extension.
Yeah. Okay. Then if you don't have any more comments on the motion or anything else, I want to thank you again for actually, staying here for such a long time, discussing the motion. It was incredibly fun. And then for the rest, I'll see you guys in the next video. Hope you had fun. Good luck.